Hey, what's up, good people? How you doing? I hope you're doing fine wherever you are today. Now, this is a presenter, Jintok Stories, and if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, and I hope that you're happy wherever you are. Now, history time. This Asian American, she talks about incredible things, important things that I found interesting, and it makes non-melanated people cringe so much because this is part of the history that they don't want to talk about and they don't want to get accountable or they don't want to be told about this. And you know that this is something that happens, right? Because when you try to talk about touching and sensitive stories about the black history that was wiped out, black people that were wiped out, especially inside the United States, because black people started dominating the United States after the slave trade was abolished, right? And they moved, they started doing business, they started thriving. But not due to white fear, they decided that, you know what we're gonna be doing? We need to find a way of stopping these people. And they did it. They did it in different ways. Like, for example, they did it through the Lake Lanier, which happened in Georgia. They did it through Central Park, New York. These are black citizen massacres. They did it through Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. They did it through Rosewood Massacre in 1923. They did it through buried or flood histories across the United States. These are things that happened, right? And this Asian American woman tries to bring out these topics to remind non-melanated people of what they have been doing, and they don't want to take accountable. They're still saying that, you know, racism doesn't exist and we didn't do nothing to black folks. But look, history will judge, because that's the truth. And these are things that happened and they're not being told in history books. I've never seen this being told or read anywhere in history books. I've never, right? So I want us to watch this video from this Asian American woman. It's history time, it's education time. If you feel like you like the video, kindly like the video so that it can, you know, reach people who are like-minded like you. Let us watch the video. I'll be back.
I find that a good way to help people who have a different lived experience than you exercise empathy for the struggles that you face that they may not be familiar with is to help them understand. And I was hoping that you could help me understand what anti-white racism looks like. Can you tell me about how you don't know where your ancestors came from because they were kidnapped and enslaved? Or how you don't know what languages they spoke, what spiritual practices they had, or what traditional knowledge that should have been your birthright was lost, not because they were allowed to and wanted to assimilate, but because their enslavers or residential schools forced them to assimilate. Can you tell me about how your ancestors had explosives tied to them while they were building the United States railroads, and then as a show of appreciation, they were excluded from society for nearly 60 years? And could you tell me about the hundreds of towns that were destroyed, like the Black towns and China towns and Japan towns, all destroyed by the same demographic? Can you tell me about the children who were unalived because they whistled at a woman or because they floated in a lake a little too far past the segregation line? And can you tell me how it was for your parents and your grandparents to be United States citizens who were put in internment camps on United States soil? Can you tell me how it was for your family to live in the back of their store because people who look like you were not allowed to purchase or rent homes? And could you tell me how it was for your parents and for you to shed blood, to be treated as human, as equal, and to be allowed to simply share the same space as other people? Can you tell me about the conversations that you have to have with your children about police interactions? And could you tell me about how your mother and your sisters and your daughters are concerned about having children because of lack of equitable access to healthcare, because doctors were told that people who look like you can't feel pain? Can you tell me how it feels to know that your ancestors lived here for thousands of years, but when you try to come here, you and your children are put in cages? And can you tell me how it felt when a few years ago, the president entertained having people who look like you expelled from the country again? Can you tell me what anti-white racism looks like beyond having your feelings hurt, feeling uncomfortable, and having your sense of superiority challenged? And when you're done telling me what anti-white racism feels like for you, could you please tell me why you're not fighting to end racism for everybody? Yes, this is really important. Asian Americans were redlined from opening businesses in white neighborhoods because white people didn't want Asian Americans operating in their neighborhoods and didn't want Asian Americans profiting off of white people. But because the positionality of Asian Americans is weaponized to oppress black people, Asian Americans were being given loans to open businesses in black communities, even though black people were not able to receive loans to open businesses in their own communities. Obviously, the issue of Asian American owned businesses operating in black communities is a huge source of tension because it is part of the daily violence faced by black people in their own communities when they are disrespected as customers, to the literal physical violence, as was the case of the salon in Brooklyn, where a black woman was locked into the salon by workers while they beat her with broomsticks, to the damage done to the psyches of particularly black children when they are accused of shoplifting. And this isn't a topic that I'm going to be able to cover in one video, but it is a conversation that I do want to start. I think that if you ask some people what was the source of the tension, they'll say the LA riots and what happened in Koreatown, but you cannot mention the LA riots without recognizing the unaliving of Latasha Harlins the year before. A 15-year-old girl who was unalived by an Asian shop owner who thought that she was shoplifting orange juice, but the money to pay for the orange juice was in her hand when she was unalived. To overlook that is to value profit and property over black bodies, which is at the root of the United States systemically racist system and capitalism. But I think that we have to go all the way back to the Civil Rights Amendment of 1964 and then the opening of Asian immigration in 1965. So in 1964, white power structure almost faced accountability to black people. Black people should have started to be able to receive loans to open businesses in their own communities. But instead, in 1965, the United States opened the door to Asian immigration, and redlining meant that Asian Americans were receiving business loans, but only to open businesses in black communities, and black people were still not receiving loans to open businesses in their own communities. So where you have this weaponized positionality of Asian Americans being put in black people's way, of course you are going to have resentment not only over the supplanted opportunity to open businesses in their communities, but also over the fact that the black dollar is now being paid out twice. Once when the customer pays for the goods or services, and then again when the Asian business owner removes that wealth from the black community. And I frequently heard the tension being framed as mutual misunderstanding, where these Asian shop owners didn't know about the civil rights struggles of black people, and black people were not familiar with the culture of Asian business owners. But I don't think that it can be framed as mutual misunderstanding where there is an uneven power dynamic. You have one demographic that is the business owners, and you have the other demographic that is having to pay. So where there is uneven power, I don't think that it's accurate to frame it as mutual misunderstanding. So my ancestors were asked by white men to come to this country, which they had stolen and forced black people to build, because they were hoping that my ancestors would be the new cheap and disposable labor to undercut the recently freed black people that lazy white men didn't want to pay. And when my ancestors wouldn't do that, they were lynched and massacred, their towns were destroyed, they were blown up while building the railroads, and ultimately they were excluded from society in the country for nearly 60 years. Then when the United States asked us to come back in the 1960s because they wanted to put us in the way of black people again, and the United States needed to rehabilitate its reputation with Asian countries that were gaining in economic and political power, we had civil rights because of black people. You're obviously not aware of this, but blessed is not a word that the global majority thinks of in association with Europeans. Words like plague and colonizer, maybe, but not blessed. And the cell phone in my hand came from China. So I don't know if you're referencing Steve Jobs or Martin Cooper or the Finnish inventor who created the first pocket-sized telecommunication device in 1917, and you probably don't know either because your education system has left you terribly ignorant and without the critical thinking skills necessary to effectively gather information. Because you believe that most great inventions can be attributed to one white person, as opposed to recognizing that the patent system is how white people colonize intellectual property. We would not have cell phones if it wasn't for the creation of the gamma electrical cell by Black inventor Henry T. Sampson. And most of our cell phones would not have microphones in them if it wasn't for the particular microphone that was created by Black inventor James Edward West. The creation of the first digital network, 1G, was launched in Japan, and then Black electrical engineer Jesse Russell pioneered the creation of 2G, which launched in Finland first. 3G launched in Japan, 4G launched in Norway, 5G launched in South Korea, and 30% of the world's cell phones are manufactured in China. Because we of the global majority recognize that collective humanity has the ingenuity and creativity of one another to thank, whereas a lot of European Americans are laboring under the delusion that the rest of us have white people to thank. And it's this narcissistic ignorance that causes people like you to do embarrassing things, like leaving comments about Europeans and cell phones on a video about systemic anti-Black racism in the United States. And while that could be written off as a comedic and senile non sequitur, we recognize it as a desperate attempt to center yourself in a conversation that has nothing to do with you. The irony being that white people like to say not all white people and they shouldn't be held accountable for the misdeeds of their ancestors, yet they want to be associated with the greatness of the things that they think they invented. So, John Michael Kohler was an American who invented the bathtub in 1883. But let's think about this critically. Do you really think that nobody took a bath until John Michael Kohler invented the bathtub in 1883? Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So what he was talking about is the fact that Africans introduced bathing and the concept of personal hygiene to Western Europe in order to build a healthier society during the 800-year occupation of Spain. In particular, a man by this name introduced the practices of bathing, shaving, and using toothpaste, as well as drastically improving the eating habits of Western Europeans. Additionally, the first recorded history of people taking baths was in India in 500 BC. A lot of us have gotten used to how little history some people like you know, particularly where it comes to anything not Eurocentric. However, I have a tip. Before you make a comment like this, do a quick Google search for whatever you think the topic at hand is. In this case, who invented bathing or who introduced bathing to Europe, and then decide whether you still want to make this comment. Hey buddy, your comment needs some help because when Dr. Earl Haas patented the tampon in 1931, he got the idea from his friend. She used a sponge because before this, women around the globe had been using tampons for thousands of years. There was a medical document that described the use of papyrus tampons that came from Egypt around the 15th century BCE. And I think what you meant to say was this modern nice world was made possible by labor and ideas stolen by white greedy bad men exploited for ruthless capitalism. Because you are yet another narcissist who's been indoctrinated by the education system to lack the critical thinking skills to understand that patenting does not equal invention. Patenting is the colonization of intellectual property, because invention usually requires the collective efforts of a diverse group of people over time. As I tell my students when they're having difficulty learning something, try to be patient and don't be too hard on yourself. The ability to apply logical reasoning to historical fact isn't going to make sense to somebody who watches a video correcting an erroneous comment about the 1800s who responds with stay in the 21st century. But it's okay, we all have our strong suits. Being an ignorant bigot isn't mine, and intelligence isn't yours. But I'm sure there are things that you're good at that you can focus on and celebrate. And if you'd like to get better at being intelligent, again, be patient, practice every opportunity that you have, and I'm sure that you can improve. I hope that helps. Important facets of my personality include kindness and empathy and the courage to speak up against wrongdoing, which is why I spend a lot of time advocating for dismantling white culture and explaining the history of current forms of systemic oppression. And my original intent was to encourage Asian Americans to engage in anti-racist work and to unlearn anti-Black bias. But who knew? There are so many narcissistic white people who show up to center themselves in conversations that don't have to have anything to do with them unless they identify with race, white supremacy culture, and
you need to know that the systemic oppression of Black people have been driven by white fear, right? It's because the fear of being overtaken by a group of people. Right now, the systematic suppression of black history and the destruction of black community have been driven by political, economic, and social motives. We need to talk about these factors because, as I said, these things have been driven by what is called white fears, right? Because they still in disbelief that how come these people, when transatlantic slave trade or when the slave trade was abolished in the United States, black people left and they became free. They were walking, they started doing business, their city started thriving, right? And these people saw to it that no, these people are going to overtake these places because they're the ones that build the United States through sweat and blood. And they know very well that these people will one day overtake these cities. So what can we do? Let's delete them. And that's what they did, right? Now, why are they keep on doing this? Why is it that they have, they fear? And these are the following ways that these people always try to erase this part of history and not talk about this. And the first thing is destruction of physical evidence. They are always trying to remove physical evidence. Now, when you talk about flooding black towns, when you talk about urban renewal and highways, when you talk about land seizure through eminent domain, these are factors that these people use to distract or to destroy physical evidence, things that might show that people existed in a given place. Right now, flooding black towns. Many historically black communities, such as the Oscarville in Georgia, were submerged under man-made lakes during projects justified as public infrastructure. Efforts Lake Lanier, for instance, obscures a thriving black town destroyed through violence before it was flooded. Right. Another thing is media misinformation and bias. And then I think everyone knows this, right? Because we have distorted coverage. Incidents like the Tulsa Race Massacre was labeled as riots rather than a massacre. This was false narrative framed against black residents as aggressors rather than victims, right? Talking about limited coverage, mainstream media of the time, often controlled by white owners, suppressed or downplayed incidents of violence against black communities to maintain societal hierarchies, right? Now, the third thing that they also managed to erase this part of history is through omission in education and curricula, right? Erasing history from schools. Educational systems did not teach about events like the Greenwood Massacre, Rosewood, or Seneca Village. Instead, curriculum centered around narratives that marginalize black contributors and struggles. And this is true. Me starting reading history books, especially as a person who have studied African American literature, African American sociology, I've not seen this part of history. I don't know why, because at some point these folks managed to distort. These folks managed to erase these from history books because they had the pen and the paper to do this. Talking about omission of educational curriculum, we also need to know that there are biased textbooks. It's true because these things are written by these folks. They're written by these people. Now, history books often omit stories of black resistance, achievement, and victimization, presenting a one-sided view of U.S. history that glorified white figures, ignoring black narratives. The fourth thing, how they did and managed to erase this, is through legislative complicity. Jim Crow laws. Okay, denied reparations, among the things that black folks have always been striving to talk about most of the time. Now, legal frameworks systematically suppress the mobility and political power of black people through disenfranchisement and segregation. These laws also retracted black communities from rebuilding after attacks. The Jim Crow laws were so crucial. They were so devastating. Those days were so crazy. You're talking about denied reparations. Survivors of events like the Tulsa Race Massacre were not compensated, and the government inaction left destroyed black towns unrepaired, erasing them from memory. Talking about control of historical documentation as my fifth point. Suppressed archives. Records dealing black achievements and atrocities against black communities were either destroyed, neglected, or locked in inaccessible archives, right? Exclusive from academic study. For decades, academic institutions did not prioritize research on black history. Did not prioritize research on black history, creating a vacuum of reliable information. Fear, intimidation, and I think we've talked about this. Journalists, historians, or activists covering these suppressed histories often faced violent backlash. For example, the Asian American sister, perfect example of this backlash. The Asian American woman faced backlash for telling the truth, for mentioning these unsettling truths about black history, right? The normalization of white supremacy, also another point. Historical whitewashing and other things that we've been talking about in this channel, right? Resistance and censorship in modern times. Yeah, we have efforts to, to reclaim history, attacks on critical race theory, amongst other things that are always happening. These people deliberately erased, distorted, destroyed, deleted these evidences, knowing damn well that it was important or it might be used against them because of the fear of being overtaken, fear of being becoming marginalized, right? So a couple of things happened, and I'm glad that we are having these discussions. And as you know, these are presenter Jindok Stories, and I'm hoping to see you on my next video. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salam.